So we are now turning from the practice room to the formal room, and we'll let the audience in. Okay, let's get everything started. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Molly Huang, Content Lead of Leader Associates and your host of today's session. I'm delighted to welcome you all to join the Impact webinar, Connecting APAC Hydrogen Supply Chain and Trade. Supply chain plays a critical role in the cost reduction of hydrogen. To secure a highly efficient and cost-competitive supply chain, we need investment for technology, for infrastructure. We need policy supports and alignment. We need expansion of new markets and demands. And we need to remove obstacles that prevent the business from thriving. In the context, with greatest honor joining us here today are 5 distinguished speakers representing the regulatory authority, the tech innovators, and the business community. They are Ms. Gabriel Henry, Director, Industry Engagement of Development, DELWP of the Victorian Government, Mr. Nick Smith, Executive Director, Growth and Low Carbon Division, Department for Energy and Mining of the South Australian Government, Mr. Dan OSullivan, Program Manager, International Hydrogen Research Collaboration of CSIRO Energy, Mr. Joe Chow, Vice President of APAC Consulting with Mackenzie. And last but not least, Mr. Conaty, Partner of Energy Transaction Practice of Hunton and Kurth. I'd also like to highlight that there is a 5-minute Q&A time, followed everyone's presentation and a group Q&A at the end of today's session. Please feel free to raise with questions should you have any. Last slides before we get everything started, I'd like to emphasize that this webinar is organized by Leader Associates as a warm-up of our physical event, the second Connecting Green Hydrogen APAC Conference and Exhibition, which will be held in Melbourne, Australia this year and upcoming July 25 to 26, consisting of 2 days of strategic conference, the H2 Tech Forum, and the Grand Exhibition Hall that brings you the first-hand technology updates. And now, without further ado, I'd like to invite out our first speaker on stage, Ms. Gabriel Henry, Director, Industry Engagement and Development of DELWP. Gabrielle, over to you.
Thanks, Molly, and thanks to you and the team for organising the event today and for allowing me to be a part of it. As Molly mentioned, I'm a director within the Energy Group in the Victorian Government Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. We are responsible for the main hydrogen policy development in our state, and I'd like to share a little bit of what we're doing with you today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which I join you and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Next slide, thanks. As you might be aware, the Victorian Government has a vision for renewable hydrogen to be part of our clean economy and the transition to a net zero emissions future. As you know, renewable hydrogen offers enormous potential as a clean and reliable alternative to natural gas, to transport fuels and industrial feedstocks. It could also fuel the next phase of the global transition to clean energy, and that makes it of real interest. And we believe that Victoria has distinct competitive advantages in developing a thriving renewable hydrogen economy, and that's due to our extensive existing natural gas distribution networks, a highly skilled gas workforce. We've got abundant renewable energy resources across the state, world-class education and research institutions. We've got interconnected transport networks from sea freight and Australia's busiest container port through road and rail connecting us to other states. And we've also got export-ready infrastructure. As mentioned, we've got 4 deep water ports across our southern coastline. And we believe that these attributes, combined with the Victorian Government's commitment to net zero emissions and a clean economy, and that's a legislated net zero emissions target by 2050, and that means we're well placed to develop a successful renewable hydrogen export market, as well as strong demand locally. Next slide, thanks. So for those of you who may not be aware, Victorian Government released a renewable hydrogen industry development plan at this time last year, and that outlines our state's key focus areas and actions to accelerate the development of a renewable hydrogen industry across our state. And it shows how we will scale up, skill up and develop the supply chain for green hydrogen. And our goal is to support both export as well as domestic demand in tandem, so that our industry can have a variety of local and international customers and support a sustainable, long-term thriving industry. Next slide, thanks. So as Victorian Government, we see ourselves as having several roles in developing both the domestic and export supply chains. We've already established deep water ports, road and rail freight corridors and gas network infrastructure, and these existing infrastructure will form the backbone of hydrogen transport. So to enable renewable hydrogen transport at scale, what we're currently doing is supporting the hydrogen energy supply chain project in the Latrobe Valley. Funding research institutions with a focus on hydrogen technology and transport. We're providing grants to industry to enable their transition, and funding studies that are looking at hydrogen distribution via the existing gas network and what upgrades would be needed to enable that, and also supporting a network of hydrogen technology clusters right across the state. Next slide, thanks. So just to touch on one of our major projects, which has been underway for some time and already has some very significant wins on the ground. The Hydrogen Energy Supply Chain Pilot Project in the Latrobe Valley is a world-first collaboration, and it involves Japanese and Australian industry, as well as the Victorian, Australian and Japanese governments all working in partnership. And this pilot will produce and transport hydrogen from the Latrobe Valley in Victoria's southeast to Kobe in Japan. And this will be the first time that liquefying hydrogen has been transported between 2 continents. And the pilot will develop a complete hydrogen supply chain by creating the hydrogen gas, by gasifying Latrobe Valley's brown coal resources, transporting it to the port of Hastings on the coast for liquefaction, and then shipping it to Japan in a purpose-built vessel. And this project provides Victoria with first mover advantages in hydrogen supply chain development, and that's through the planning, design, construction and commissioning of hydrogen production and transport infrastructure. And this includes valuable insights ranging from distribution, exports, and right through to skills and workforce development. The commercialisation phase of the project will be contingent on the availability of economic carbon capture and storage, and that's being investigated through the CarbonNet project in Gippsland. So note that while this pilot project is highly relevant to the establishment of hydrogen export supply chains in our state, the project actually sits outside of the scope of the industry development plan, which is focused on hydrogen from renewable resources. However, as you'll all well know, once you've produced the hydrogen, there's a lot of other things associated with the development of industry that are agnostic of where it's actually come from once you're moving it, storing it, using it, having skills and training, standards, and so on. So it's a very significant in terms of creating the pathways to market for hydrogen in our state. Next slide, thanks. So a critical way to develop supply chains for hydrogen for export and domestic use is to invest in developing hydrogen transport technologies. So the Victorian government has provided funding for the HyCell facility at Deakin University's Renewables campus, which is on the coast in the state southwest. And that's one of Australia's first facilities for testing, manufacturing and providing training in new hydrogen technologies. Their areas of research will include fuel cells for transport, especially heavy vehicles, as well as assessing the suitability for natural gas pipelines to carry hydrogen for housing and industry. Both fuel cells and gas pipelines are critical areas where further testing and development will support greater efficiencies and confidence in being able to use and move renewable hydrogen from one location to another. The Victorian government is also a founding member of the Australian Hydrogen Centre. And they are conducting 3 renewable hydrogen gas blending feasibility studies, and these will consider the potential and barriers to the injection of up to 10% of renewable hydrogen blended gas into gas distribution networks in regional towns in Victoria, and the injection of 10% hydrogen into the Victorian gas distribution network overall. And finally, the full conversion of 100% hydrogen in the Victorian gas network in the longer term. The pathway to investigate the potential for Victoria's extensive gas network for renewable hydrogen is a critical path for ensuring an efficient and well-connected supply chain for the sector. So another way the Victorian government is building supply chains is by attracting commercial investment in renewable hydrogen projects through large-scale grant programs. And that includes the Energy Innovation Fund, and that's making available approximately $90 million for funding in transformational energy projects beyond 2025. And that's technology agnostic. So it's not just hydrogen, it's all sorts of future-looking technologies. We've also got the $2 billion Breakthrough Victoria Fund, and over the next 10 years, that'll drive investment in research, innovation and commercialisation to accelerate growth in key industry sectors, and that includes advanced manufacturing and the clean economy. With more investment will come better developed supply chains and the confidence for businesses to test and expand their reach into renewable hydrogen. Next slide, thanks. So the Victorian government is supporting renewable hydrogen supply chain development through tailored renewable hydrogen grants as well. And these grants are aimed at supporting businesses to transition to renewable hydrogen, at first by conducting feasibility studies, and then completing actual on-the-ground pilots and demonstrations. And both these processes involve exploring and testing the supply chains needed to support their businesses to use renewable hydrogen. So in the first grant, which is the Renewable Hydrogen Business Ready Fund, we've got more than $600,000 to be shared by 8 recipients to develop business cases or feasibility studies to support their transition to renewable hydrogen. And some examples of funding that we've given, as shown on the slide here, include a crematorium looking to use renewable hydrogen in place of natural gas to meet growing demand for green end-of-life services. We've got a water corporation looking to produce renewable hydrogen at a water treatment site using recycled water. And then oxygen, which is a byproduct of hydrogen production from electrolysis, can also be used in water treatment processes. So this is a really important example that has the potential for replication across the sector. And as a final example, we've got a university seeking to replace on-campus natural gas use with renewable hydrogen. Next slide, thanks. We've also got a dedicated fund, as mentioned, looking at the commercialisation pathways. We've got $6.6 million to support 6 projects that will see Victoria produce and use renewable hydrogen in real-world applications. And the successful projects we're funding here include Volgren Australia, who will develop 2 commercial-grade hydrogen fuel cell electric buses for trials in Dandenong in the east of our capital city, Melbourne. While Viva Energy will develop a hydrogen refuelling station to co-locate with electric vehicle charging in a public service station. Air Liquide and Energy Sys Australia will develop renewable hydrogen production facilities for transport, while Boundary Power will develop an Australian first solar renewable hydrogen standalone power system. And while these grants are focused on local demand, production and supply chains, they're critical Victoria to build the capability to support a full-scale export economy. Next slide, thanks. So how does this all fit together? To connect these resources and opportunities across the state, we're establishing a network of hydrogen hubs, towns and clusters, and this will help us build both export and domestic demand at the same time, so we can scale up our hydrogen economy more quickly. Export hubs will be in locations with deep water ports, while towns, which will focus on domestic supply and demand in the first instance, could be located right throughout Victoria's regions, as shown in the diagram here. We want to also support collaboration across the hydrogen supply chain, and that's why we're co-funding regional hydrogen technology clusters in our state. And these clusters connect hydrogen players from academia, government, industry, international investors, and are facilitating partnerships to drive opportunities to collaborate, attract investment, solve industry-wide challenges, and drive commercial projects. Our 4 initial clusters are in the Greater Geelong region, just southwest of Melbourne, in Clayton, in the city of Melbourne, in the Mallee region in the state's northwest, and also in Gippsland in the state's southeast. And these are all seen as areas with high potential for renewable hydrogen. Next slide, thanks. So we're keen to work closely with business and industry, both locally and internationally, to develop export demand and to establish and refine the supply chain needed to support renewable hydrogen exports. And we welcome the opportunity to discuss your business or initiative with us, whether it's to better understand our state, to meet our vibrant industry players and leaders, or to locate your operations or business here. So please do get in touch. Next slide, thanks. So thanks everyone for your time today. As you see sort of through the activities I've touched on today, work is progressing rapidly in the sector in Victoria, and I look forward to sharing with you further upcoming initiatives as they're developed as we work to achieving our state's renewable hydrogen division. You can find our renewable hydrogen industry development plan and further details about the hydrogen grants I've covered today at the link displayed on this slide. You see down the bottom, the link to our website. Our business and industry engagement team would also be very happy to discuss your plans with you, and their contact details are there. And thanks everyone, and I'd be very happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Gabrielle, for the very detailed introduction and explanation. Victoria is indeed one of the most successful states in leading the hydrogen supply chain and export. As some of the listeners are still digesting all the information, allow me to take the opportunity and raise to you 2 questions from my side. So question number 1, policy is the most important driver to any forms of business. In the past year, we see a skyrocketing clean hydrogen boom in the United States, driven by the passage of the Build Back Better bill, which is a 10-year tax credit for green and blue hydrogen development. As we also promote low carbon hydrogen in Victoria and also in South Australia and in Australia in general, where we have different legal regimes for different colors of hydrogen, and will there be more policy encouragements in the year to come in both the production and delivery segment?
Sure, thanks, Molly. So just to be clear, we seek to have a coordinated approach to hydrogen development in our state, recognising that we've already got important developments underway in each type of hydrogen generation, but noting, as I said, that there's a whole range of things that will affect the development of a sustainable hydrogen industry, regardless of how it's generated. And we're looking through the Renewable Hydrogen Industry Development Plan of making sure that we've got those in place. We've got 18 outcomes that we're looking and focusing on, which we see as the key building blocks that we need to make sure are in place to develop a thriving and sustainable hydrogen policy environment and in our state. Looking at those sort of areas, whether that's skills and training, standard, regulation, supply chain, how to move it, store it. We're working on a whole range of fronts right across the Victorian government in cooperation with all of our colleagues. And whilst I can't talk about any upcoming policy developments, unfortunately, that's a matter for our ministers and cabinet, and I can't preempt that. Other to say that, you know, this is certainly not the last that we'll have to say on this topic. And I would just sort of say, look, in the usual sort of cycles of when interesting things tend to be said in government, our budget cycles are usually announced around May, so there's often some new initiatives announced about then, and we're also likely to have a state election announced later on this year, and ministers tend to get a little bit excited about saying things prior to those elections. So they're my hints in terms of, whilst I can't say anything, please do keep your ears to the ground for any future announcements.
Yeah, understood. But also I'd like to reflect some of the industrial voices that we heard. So apart from fundings in the CapEx part, in the production part, there are also voices shouting out for incentives or encouragements in the OPEX and the midstream and in the distribution side. So it would be highly appreciated if the Victorian government or the federal government can consider to put it into considerations.
Thank you, noted. And we recognise that there is a wide range of needs for government involvement and support right across the sector. We're really starting from what's close to a standing start across the world in looking at hydrogen development, and we've got a lot of work to do on a lot of fronts. We do believe that having the hydrogen energy supply chain project has really given us a leading advantage in Victoria in terms of actually having an on-the-ground project where we've made significant learnings in connecting supply chain to international markets, and we look forward on building that and further supporting the industry as it develops.
Yes, and also a second question, which is still revolves around the revenue mechanism. So in addition to potential tax incentives, there are also discussions to propose an international carbon trading market to encourage more countries to benefit from their renewable energy actions. Is the Victorian government also paying attention to the carbon trading market? And what do you think is the current gap or missing links from this goal?
I would say sort of yes, of course, we're keeping an eye on international developments in this sense. We have to recognise that in a state we're also part of a national picture, and we have separate policy development at the national level compared to what we do at the states. You know, again, I'm not going to forecast anything in that area other than to note again that we do have legislated net zero emission targets by 2050, and we've also made interim targets sort of for leading up to that to ensure that we meet that target, and we'll be looking at various mechanisms for being able to achieve those aims.
Mm-hmm. And I have one question remaining in the Q&A box from Mohammed. How is the outlook for the energy market in Australia with green hydrogen projects becoming commercial? I'm not sure I quite understand what the question is.
I do. I think if I understand it correctly, I can take that one on. I think it's something that there's, you know, we've seen internationally that there's always various opinions on when sort of green hydrogen is likely to become commercial, and that essentially means when is it going to be competitive with other fuels to replace other types of fuels. And I think what we have to look at, and others have obviously done this with various differing results from their analysis, is what does that mean for Victoria, and where is some of the low-hanging fruit for Victoria? And some applications may be further off than others, but where we're seeing some of the early interest is in fuels for heavy vehicles. As a diesel replacement, it's getting sort of pretty close to parity, and we're sort of seeing that it's really just some of the initial infrastructure costs that might need some assistance, but once you're actually up and running, that the fuel costs are getting pretty close to diesel. And I think that is really important, you know, for Victorian context. We're one of the more populous states in Australia. That I wouldn't say that we are densely populated compared to many of our close Asian neighbours, but we compared to the rest of the country, we have interconnected networks and freight routes, sort of both road and rail, connecting into our ports and right across the state. And that gives us a really great opportunity to look at that as an opportunity, and we're seeing industry already start to make movements in that area, and some of the research that HyCell is doing is looking into that region as well. So that would be sort of one of the early areas that we're looking at, and we see various other projections, and obviously we need to look from a government perspective in terms of which ones we might provide some suitable incentives to, and we have provided some incentives. For instance, we've got a zero emission vehicle bus trial currently underway, and looking at various other ways that we can investigate some opportunities in that area. So it is very much a watch this space, but I think that Victoria does have some unique opportunities that we can start looking at now, is becoming close to commercial.
Right, and apart from hydrogen, Victoria also have just announced its ambitious offshore wind target. I believe there will be more opportunities coming to Victoria, and I wish you all the best. There are some questions that will be coming for you in the Q&A box. It will be appreciated if you can kindly wait for several more minutes, and I'll come back to you later. Thanks, Gabriel. And next, let's invite out Mr. Nick Smith, Executive Director of Growth and Low Carbon Division of Department for Energy and Mining of the South Australian Government. There are also a lot of practices are undergoing in SA. I look forward to understanding more. Over to you, Nick. Nick?
Thank you, Molly. Sorry, just getting my screen open, and hopefully you can see that now. Is that coming up for you, Molly?
Yeah.
Excellent. So thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you very much for inviting me to come and present on behalf of South Australia. I guess I was asked to talk about, you know, from South Australia to Asia, how do we develop a CO2-free hydrogen supply chain? A little bit about my team. We are here to deliver the government's agenda around growth state. Noting that we have an election on Saturday, so we may have a little bit of a change of focus depending on the outcomes of that election. But broadly, our remit in the Growth and Low Carbon Division is to capture the economic opportunities around South Australia's clean energy and the opportunity to decarbonise our minerals more broadly. So we have a strong focus on hydrogen, electric vehicles, decarbonisation of steel, copper, graphite, etc. So, and look, if you think about where we've come from in, you know, we're now one of the world's leaders in terms of variable renewable energy integration into the networks. We've gone from 1% to just over 62% in 15 years. And I guess the slide that this shows here on the right-hand side is going back to 1998, the mix of energy in South Australia, which was largely dominated by coal in the brown and gas in the orange, with the purple being imports from Victoria. And that was around the time of the commencement of the national electricity market. And you can see there in 2006, 2007, the first wind projects starting to come on in green in South Australia, and the significant increase in wind and subsequently solar from 2011, which is really driven by the cost-effective nature of it and some good subsidies in terms of a policy perspective. In 2016, we closed our only coal-fired power station, which meant that we went to gas and renewables, and we're well on track for achieving 100% renewables by 2030. In fact, the 62% was for the financial year 2021. The Australian Energy Market Operator has just come out and announced that we've achieved 63% for the calendar year to the end of 2021. So it's been a pretty stunning transformation. And I guess we do, why hydrogen to us? Because we've just got these globally competitive wind and solar resources. What you see here is some data from the Australian Energy Market Operator, highlighting the amount of renewable generation which exceeded demand in South Australia last year. So on 180 days last year, we had excess renewable generation in South Australia, and we were looking to export it into Victoria and to other states. Challenge we've got is that, part of the 1 in 3 households in South Australia have rooftop solar, which is a disaggregated market, and we're now seeing in the middle of the day the record operational lows for demand is causing a lot of negative pricing, which also lends itself towards hydrogen development, because we can use hydrogen electrolysis to soak up the excess renewable energy in the marketplace and produce green hydrogen at a very, very low cost. So it's a very exciting time for us. It's a very challenging time, and technically it's been very difficult. We've had to work our way through the more technical challenges with the Australian Energy Market Operator and some of the smarter people in industry. With the big battery, we've put synchronous condensers in, and we're likely to be the first gigawatt scale network in the world to operate with zero synchronous generation operating in the not too distant future. You can see down in the bottom pie chart there, 35.7% of South Australia's energy came from gas in 2021. 43.9 from wind, and the remainder from solar, with a little bit of battery in there as well from the 4 grid scale batteries we have. So we really have and really are blessed with this very complementary wind and solar resource that enables very high utilisation of these renewables in an industrial environment. So I guess when we talk about South Australia's clean hydrogen advantages, it's not only green. Whilst we do have these world-class complementary solar and wind resources that offer very high utilisation of electrolysers, in excess of 70%, we've also got Santos developing the Moomba Carbon Capture and Storage project, which is through a depleted gas field that's been operating in the northeast of South Australia for the last 50 years. Santos are expecting that to be the second largest CCS project in the world and lowest cost project in the world, and targeting the full life cycle cost of less than $30 a tonne for Australian for CO2 sequestered underground. The Santos announced financial investment decision last year on the Moomba Carbon Capture and Storage, and Moomba is connected to Port Bonython near the South Australian coast via a pipeline, which enables it to export hydrocarbons out through Port Bonython, and is also connected into the east coast of Australia with gas pipelines as well. From a policy perspective, we've had very good bipartisan political support for our hydrogen and renewables industry over the last 10 years. We currently have a hydrogen action plan that was announced and released in September 2019, which has got 5 core pillars about facilitating investments in hydrogen infrastructure, establishing the world-class regulatory framework, deepening our trade relationships and supply capabilities. Importantly, fostering innovation and workforce skills development, which is critical for an industry at scale. And importantly, how do we integrate hydrogen into our energy systems? Gabriel talk about a lot of the work that the Australian Hydrogen Centre is doing. The Future Fuels CRC is also doing some fantastic work around how do we blend hydrogen into the natural gas network. And I think that the health benefits that are associated with the reduction in CO2 and NOx emissions that seem to be coming out of the blending of hydrogen at 28% are significant, and I think that there's some real opportunities, particularly in the current oil or the energy spike that we're seeing, price spike that we're seeing, to blend hydrogen more broadly. Of course, we have the AGIG built the Tonsley gas precinct there, which has got Australia's largest hydrogen electrolyser at 1.25 megawatts, and they're blending 5% blend of hydrogen into the natural gas network in the suburb of Mitchell Park in South Australia. So there we have not only green, but we also have blue hydrogen as a real cost competitive opportunity for South Australia. In regards to how do we get this to how do we share our renewable resources with other countries, and how do we help other countries to do this? Last year, the South Australian government announced an expression of interest around Port Bonython, which is a couple of thousand hectares of government-owned land. You can see down in the bottom left corner the picture of the existing facilities, the hydrocarbon facilities that are there that Santos own. And recently the partners were announced with some fairly heavy hitters involved. Santos, Fortescue Future Industries, Chiyoda Oceania, Mitsubishi Australia, Enios out of Japan, H2U, AMP Energy from Canada, Origin Energy, and Neoen, the French renewables developer. They're all involved in and have been shortlisted to develop projects in and around the Port Bonython region. That has the potential to produce in excess of 1.5 million tonnes per annum of hydrogen in various different forms. Now, I guess if you have a look at that slide, the picture on the right-hand side shows the proximity of the Moomba gas processing facility in the Cooper Basin. The red dot that's just next to the word Whyalla is where Port Bonython is. And we also have Trafigura, one of the world's largest independently owned commodity traders, developing a 440 megawatt green hydrogen project at Port Pirie, starting with a stage 1 at 85 to 90 megawatts of electrolysis, which is really designed to produce 20% of their smelter, their polymetal smelter at Port Pirie, 20% of the oxygen demand for that. Trafigura are also the world's largest wet fleet shipping owner, and so looking to produce hydrogen, convert the hydrogen into ammonia for potential uses as either a trading commodity or for use in their shipping in the longer term future. We also, out of Port Bonython, we have a strategic supply chain study that we developed with the Port of Rotterdam and a partnership that we have under an MOU. We announced the results of the supply chain study at the end of last year. And I think the lessons learnt from that is that the pre-feasibility study identified that South Australia can ship hydrogen to Western Europe cost competitively if we're just due to the fact that we're able to use our highly complementary world-class renewable resources, and we have available land, lower cost infrastructure. We have existing infrastructure there. So what does that mean? I guess that means that given that Asia's a lot closer than Western Europe, Asia becomes even more economically viable. And you can see some of the outcomes. I've chosen a couple of slides from the publicly available study that we did with the Port of Rotterdam. And I think that we've seen, as a result of the war in Ukraine and the sanctions on Russia, there's been a quadrupling of demand expectation for hydrogen into Europe by 2030. This aligns with what Japan's been doing in terms of their 10-time increase of expected hydrogen demand by 2030 to 3 million tonnes per annum. So I think that South Australia is in a very solid position. And really, you can see some of in that bottom right-hand slide, you can see some of the roles that will be played in the hydrogen supply chain and some of the partners that will be involved in that around how we will actually integrate ourselves into that hydrogen supply chain into Asia. So I think that there's a lot of lessons to be learnt from this that can be applied from South Australia shipping our renewable energy to countries in Asia and the Pacific region more broadly. Most importantly, I think what we've seen as partnerships are critical for developing high quality frameworks for hydrogen. In particular, from a global perspective, having good relationships and being able to share information, is critical around harmonisation of standards, making sure that we have an industry that is going up at scale that is very safe and is supported by it has social license to operate by communities. It needs to be economically sustainable. We don't want to be putting additional regulatory tape, red or green tape on the development of the industry just because we don't understand the risks. So, we want it to be clean. We know the opportunity to decarbonise our world. We saw the impact when the lockdowns occurred at the start of COVID, the impact on the environment and what it meant. But I think that, whatever we do, sharing of information and sharing of knowledge and developing the supply chain and working together to support that is going to be critically important. And that applies whether it's from industry, research, international partnerships, but also government relationships with all of those and the facilitation of good policy that underpins all of that. From our side of things, for further information, the simplest way to find the information on hydrogen in South Australia is to go to the link that's shown there, hydrogen.sa.gov.au. That will take you to our website where you can find all of the information about the Port of Rotterdam study, Hydrogen Action Plan, projects that we've got going on in South Australia. There's more information around that in the energy mining website there. So I've also created a link there for you. And if you'd like to reach out, feel free, and look forward to having further conversations with you shortly.
Thank you, Nick, so much for the kind introduction. It's very informative and productive. I learned a lot from your presentation. And to summarize, if you can name the top 3 factors that can help accelerate the creation of an APAC supply chain, what would that be?
Look, I think the key thing for producers is having an off-taker. That's the critical thing. Investment in megawatt scale, gigawatt scale projects, I should say, they require some certainty of off-take. Fantastic to see that in Japan, JERA's just done the first RFP for green ammonia for them to do their trials in the coal-fired power station at Hunton. To do those trials on what the blending of ammonia will be like. So matching supply and demand becomes really critical. I think once you've got that alignment and that risk allocation becomes a lot simpler. It's a matter of just building it at scale. We've seen liquid hydrogen, a fantastic piece of work done by the hydrogen energy supply chain in Victoria and Japan more broadly, but it still has a long way to go as a carrier. the feedback at this stage is that ammonia looks to be the most cost-effective way of using it. I think longer term we'll ultimately see multiple different hydrogen derivatives to feed into different supply chains depending on their need for hydrogen and the purity of it.
Right. I think we've heard a lot about the partnerships that you are negotiating right now, or you are pushing forward right now. What about the policy planning for the midstream development? Any incentives or any further plans that we can expect?
Look, I think we've invested $40 million over the last few years in hydrogen projects at pilot scale. What we're seeing now is that, we've invested in supporting Trafigura's FEED study. We're now starting to see that the pilot projects are delivering in many respects, and the scale is starting to be developed by industry itself. So we've de-risked that in many respects. There's still a lot of work to be done in terms of domestic use for hydrogen. The blending of gas in the networks. We're taking the learnings out of what's going on down at Tonsley and the AGIG project, where they're blending hydrogen into the natural gas network. South Australia's changed our petroleum and we're in the process of changing our Petroleum and Geothermal Energy Act to the Energy Resources Act to enable the licensing of green hydrogen to be afforded the licensing regime, the one window to government that the oil and gas industry have. So there's a lot of work going on in the background, and I guess subsequent to our election outcome on the weekend, we'll have a little bit more clarity on which way we'll be heading with that. So it's a very exciting time, and I think hydrogen in the current energy environment is going to only increase in demand. And there's a regulatory. South Australia's had a hydrogen regulatory working group for some years. They are working their way through the regulatory environment to refine our processes and systems to make sure that we can streamline large-scale investment in and around renewables and green hydrogen and blue hydrogen, carbon capture and storage. We're also, for a state that has 1 million square kilometres and a very low density rate with very high quality wind resources onshore, we've seen also a lot of interest of late in offshore wind in South Australia. So we are looking to mirror Commonwealth legislation once that passes through, so that we can have a harmonised regulatory environment given the close intersection between state and Commonwealth waters. So, there's a lot happening in the space that will support the supply chain.
Right. And one last question before we wrap up the talk. So it's kind of a Eastern egg question that was reserved for you and Gabriel. So if you have one question for the Victorian government or for Gabriel, if there's one lesson that you want to learn from them, what would the question would be?
Oh, look, it's
Gabriel, you can also answer your questions.
Look, I think from my perspective, I think I support their plans for their 9 gigawatts of offshore wind. I think for me, the question will be how are they going to manage an orderly transition away from coal longer term to help decarbonise their networks. What does that look like? I don't think that they've got the answers to that just yet. I don't think the Australian Energy Market Operator or the regulators or the Commission have any have a foolproof answer to that. But I think that's the challenge: is how do we decarbonise our energy system so that we can support the economies of the rest of the world to help them achieve their decarbonisation aims through delivering renewables. Thanks, Molly.
Gabriel, you want to make some comments?
Yes, thank you. And Nick, you have really pointed out what is our biggest challenge in terms of looking at that energy transition and coming from an energy system where traditionally We generated all our energy pretty much from brown coal in one part of the state and then send it to everyone else in another part of the state. We've got a huge challenge ahead of us, and that's already really well underway. So we've already got distributed generation through renewable energy across the state. And we're making significant investment also in our grid infrastructure across the state to enable us to use it in new ways, recognising that we are generating and using energy very differently to how we did even 5 or 10 years ago. So in our budget, last year's budget, we had over $500 million dedicated towards investment in renewable energy zones to make sure that we've got that supporting infrastructure to help us be able to inject more renewable energy generation into the grid. And we've also obviously supported storage technologies such as Victoria's big battery to make sure that we can create new sources of baseload power or virtual baseload power as we reach towards our energy transition. And just looking at offshore wind as one potential addition into that mix. There's a lot of moving parts in terms of changing how we generate energy, how we use energy, how we store it, and how we move it around. And we're very active across all of those challenges.
I hope Nick's satisfied with the question. And Gabriel, it's your time to throw back one.
Okay. I guess I'm very interested in some of the recent developments in, looking at your port infrastructure and some of the potential outreach to markets there. How does the development of the ports couple with your domestic development, market development? Is there a sort of parallel development, or is there a focus more on one than the other?
Look, it's a really good question, and I think probably the projects that are really driving Port Bonython, they've got a long lead for their financial investment decision, but it's really around, for us, that's about supporting them in terms of what infrastructure and what what workforce requirements, what sort of what's the supporting infrastructure that they're going to need for the export side of things. From a domestic side of things, we're looking at our public transport sector. We're working closely with our the South Australian H2H cluster, the hydrogen hub, the hub-to-hub cluster, who's working with a whole range of parties around the mining sector and the transport sector more broadly. One of the things that we really want to focus on from our side of things is how do we help to decarbonise the mining sector and really reduce their reliability on diesel, and how can we actually look at remote power stations? How do we displace the diesel with decarbonised opportunities there? So there's a lot of focus on the domestic sector in terms of developing that up. There's a lot of thoughts and projects being proposed, and I guess we're working closely with the H2H cluster because we see that as a good platform for industry engagement more broadly, and industry knowledge and sharing around that side of things.
Very much looking forward to seeing it all develop.
Yeah,
Thanks, Gabrielle.
I think there'll be a lot more brainstorming off the stage. And thank you so much, Nick. Thank you so much, Gabrielle, for joining us today.
Very welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, and let's welcome our next speaker, Mr. Dan OSullivan, Program Manager of International Hydrogen Research Collaboration of CSIRO Energy, who will be presenting on accelerating Australia's role in the global hydrogen supply chains through collaborative research. Dan, may you start with a short self-introduction about yourself and what's your role in terms of the supply chain development, and what are your current emphases? Dan, I think you're muted.
Sorry, someone always still does that in meetings because we all still get used to the online work we're doing. Yeah, so last year I started working in a program that was begun by the Department of Industry, Science and Energy Resources in Australia, setting up an international program on hydrogen research. And today I'll largely be talking about that program and how it's been influenced by other policy decisions at the federal level and on the ground actions. And I presume also, Molly, I get the chance to ask the other presenters a question and what you were doing just there with the others. And my question I'll ask in advance because I'd love some input over today and off the stage is what are the research priorities that can help accelerate the industry? Because that's essentially what my program is all about. So Molly, I'll just continue with the presentation now.
Yeah, please.
Okay. Okay, I hope you can see the slides properly now.
Yes, we can.
Thanks, Molly. And I just wanted to also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm meeting on today here in Brisbane, the Turrbal Aboriginal tribe, and the past and present members of that tribe. I thought I'd also explain a little bit about the agency I work for, the CSIRO here in Australia. It's been around for nearly 100 years now and have had a lot of impact on science and technology in Australia and other parts of the world, making things like Wi-Fi possible, the polymer banknotes, which came out several years ago, in impacts in the health area, such as the wellbeing diet and pesticides and herbicides, and keeping mosquitoes away with AeroGuard. So it's a very broad-based, multidisciplinary science agency, estimated to have an impact on the Australian economy of around $4.5 billion a year. We have around 5,500 people working across Australia and the globe and have offices in many parts of the world, such as Singapore, Indonesia, Vietnam, USA, Chile, and other parts. So it's very handy to be able to talk to a global audience today, particularly APAC, because a lot of the program that I'm setting up will be influencing those economies and setting up partnerships, research partnerships in those regions. Now, Australia, as the other presenters showed, does offer all the key ingredients to set up a hydrogen supply chain from go to woe. Geoscience Australia have a tool that they put in place recently, looking at the hydrogen fairway opportunities. So this basically looks at all the renewable energy and gas opportunities around Australia and how we can connect them with the infrastructure we have here and also export it overseas. And a lot of Asian countries already have signalled that they'd be very willing to participate in offtake agreements with Australia for hydrogen. And this is one of the maps and integrated approaches that we're starting to see more and more of and show the opportunities. A lot more work though needs to be done on pinpointing those and understanding the pros and cons. And Australia's been one of those countries that's always been blessed with resources, but sometimes overly blessed, and we have this resource curse. And we need to work out in advance and as early as possible what other things we can include and attach to those resources, such as manufacturing. So if you look at other industries, which we have a lot to learn from, such as the car industry and the solar industry, it's ebbed and flowed in terms of manufacturing and what we've been able to do here. So it's a very careful and in-depth question to be able to look at the supply chain as a whole, and projects like the one that Gabrielle talked about, which are attempting to do exactly that by shipping hydrogen up to Kobe in Japan, and the Viva project are great ways to start testing this and work out our true opportunities. So this bigger picture view of trying to work out where opportunities are is being led by a national strategy put together by the Australian government. And it's ended up being looked at in terms of two major steps. The first step is building the domestic demand. And I think Nick went into this quite well, where production now looks like it's well on its way. Lots of things still to do in production, of course. It needs to get greener, it needs to get cheaper. But there's other parts of the supply chain that might let us down. And one of them is the demand side. So Australia is busy at setting up these hubs, and a hub could be a local city, it could be a marine port, or even a isolated regional area where it will need to put a lot of supply and demand through. And Australia has a lot of those isolated type areas. And we need to start showcasing them and testing them. In the program that I'm currently working on, we've been able to talk to a lot of researchers around the world and industry. And it's certainly highlighted that we need to really understand how these hubs can work and build up this demand side knowledge. So Australia's dedicated $464 million to setting up these hubs, and they're well underway. The second part of the strategy is setting up these international partnerships, and this is where my program's trying to have a big impact. The government has put forward $565 million towards these low emission partnerships, and we already have 6 in place. Germany's been set up recently, trying to look at the complete supply chain and what can happen with the technologies being looked after in an incubator way. Partnerships with Japan are looking at ammonia, liquid natural gas, and other low options that we can pursue with Japan. Singapore has a $30 million partnership to look at reducing emissions in the maritime sector, and we've recently announced others with India and the UK, with others more to come, given that large package of money and opportunities. Now I'll talk a bit about my program that I'm involved in. So this is one of my key slides for today. This program was announced last year by our Minister of Industry, Energy and Emissions, Angus Taylor. And it's a humble start, I guess, at what kind of research can begin in this space with the number of countries that we want to partner with going forward. And I also want to point out that it's a partnership with the Australian Hydrogen Research Network. So this does represent all Australian universities. There's 4 key components to the program. The first is to do an international scan of the globe and understand what research is going on connected to the industry possibilities, and then set up some research delegations and exchanges according to those possibilities. We've already set up a hydrogen knowledge centre, which is sharing all the information and data that exists with all the work going on in Australia and as much as we can from overseas. It's an incredibly hard beast to keep track of, but the number of hits we're getting on that, which is over 10,000 a month, is quite huge, and showing it's well worth putting this knowledge sharing work together. And finally, early next year, we hope to hold an international conference, bringing in many of the international people that we've been meeting recently and in the near future, to hold a international conference. Now I'll talk a bit about how we chose, I guess, this top 10. And first of all, say that it's not limited to this top 10. I think it can form a partnership and collaborative exercise with anybody if the opportunity is there. But we had to make a decision, I guess, on who first to go out and talk to. So we got our futures team here at the CSIRO to do a scan of the R&D landscape and industry opportunities going on around the world, and looked at things like the stated government priorities, the R&D program funding, patents, IP, other IP metrics, publications, and clean hydrogen demos happening on the ground. And we also need to, I guess, scan that with the sensibility and ease of doing business in countries and even managing COVID, which is going to make travelling with this program quite a challenge. But after you look at all those criteria, these 10 pop out as priorities that we would like to certainly start meeting with. We've already held over about 30 initial engagements, meetings with the who's who in the research and industry in these countries. And over the next coming months, we'll hold some delegations, hopefully, COVID permitting, with these countries that can pave the way to 30 or 40 researchers doing research over there for several months, up to perhaps 12 months, and then come back and report to that. And it's a two-way exchange program where we'd invite these researchers back as well. Some other things are popping out already from these initial talks, and they are matters of global importance, such as trying to produce low-cost electrolyzers, storage capacity, and the mobility activation market, all seen as research priorities, but it is still very hard to work out how you would spend that money and guide the researchers into those priority areas. So again, Nick and Gabrielle and many others, I'd love to hear your opinion on what you think the research priorities are. I thought I'd also mention another collaborative activity that you may have heard of, because it's been around since 2015. The Mission Innovation Clean Energy program was born out of the Paris Agreement. There's 22 countries and the European Commission involved in this, which represents apparently about 90% of the investment going into clean tech around the world. And they've got 7 missions under this program occurring, and hydrogen is one of those key missions which the CSIRO is heavily involved in. We actually wrote a paper which is worth looking at. If you can see that link there, it's worth looking at that. I think it's called Appendix 2, which is attempting to highlight some research strategies, which I'll come to in a minute. So one of the goals of this mission is to come up with at least 100 large-scale activities to get us through the valley of death, so to speak, and out the other side. So I'll just go through some highlights from the paper that was put forward there by Peter Grubnick, a colleague here at CSIRO, and other messages we've been getting from our international engagements already. So it's worth pondering these 7, and I'd love to get any feedback on these whatsoever. And the first is, of course, cost reduction. I think if hydrogen doesn't get to its $2 a kilogram goal, it's going to struggle having large-scale activation. At the moment, you'll see fossil-based costs of around 50 cents to $1.70 US dollars. Gets a bit more expensive, $1 to $2 with CCS involved. But renewable energy is up around $3 to $8, depending on how it's done and where it is, and that's got to come right down. Another one is, the second one I wanted to talk about is storage and distribution. We had a good meeting here yesterday, actually, with members of the research community and industry in Australia, and there was about 12 people on that call and discussing these themes. And storage and distribution actually came out as a deal breaker. It's very challenging to keep hydrogen still, as you know. It actually leaks through steel, and you need vacuum seals to keep it from doing that. And at the moment, the storage is very small, and we're still working how to distribute. So if we can't do this, it's going to be a definite deal breaker. Targeted mobility. I think the others talked a bit about this already, but it's almost like there's a bit of sport for choice with EVs and other clean techs and hydrogen as well in terms of opportunities. But we need targeted effort on where to place, I guess, those resources and come up with solutions. So, for example, in Australia, it could well be that we focus on heavy road transport as being something to move on there. Substituting fossil fuel that is used in the industrial processes for heat and also for the making of chemicals is a big opportunity. And steel making is being discussed almost universally with all the countries that we're talking about, and using heat better. and then actually using fuel substitution again for domestic and industrial processes where there's natural gas. Nick talked a bit about the blending being up around 5–10%. Of course, at some stage, we'd like that to be a lot higher and start placing gas where we can. Hydrogen could also help in electricity networks. With renewables coming on more and more, we have a lot of frequency and variability issues. And so if we get on top of our storage and distribution issues with hydrogen, it could really help balance out what's happening in electricity networks. And finally, there's these cross-cutting themes. This is a big issue. It also needs to be up there with the storage and distribution as a deal breaker. And these are matters like health standards, guaranteeing the hydrogen meets certain standards, safety, and social acceptance in communities being supportive of the projects going on. And if we don't get on top of those early as well, in a timely manner, it will certainly slow down the industry. So some of the discussions we've been having with countries like Japan, we're already looking at trying to move on research with electricity generation, electrolysis, transport, chemical carriers. Korea, we're looking at fossil fuel conversion, electricity generation, compression and liquefaction. And Singapore, we've been talking a bit more about ammonia cracking and maritime decarbonisation. So over the next few months, we'd actually like to pinpoint that. We can't do everything with everybody. So we are at the stage now where we'd like to pinpoint the topics on what we can do with the countries that we're talking about. Finally, I thought just got a few more slides to talk about how to form research partnerships. So one of the themes today is about collaboration, and collaboration is very challenging. Most collaboration efforts actually fail, whether they be just in simple business or research, or even having a family lunch sometimes. You've got to put some effort in what people want and how to go about it. You've got to work out whether it's going to be a basic coordination exercise or a collaborative effort or simple cooperative measures. So we're looking at this from a top-down, bottom-up approach, from what is the national governments doing in terms of trying to set up and having a history of diplomacy between each other, to what's industry and research has already got in place, who are they talking to and what are they setting up. And in the middle there, over the next few months, we'll come up with taking advantage of these existing R&D projects that exist, established programs such as the low emissions technology program that I talked a bit about already, where it's getting hundreds of millions of dollars put into that and taking advantage of that where we can, or simply just creating new opportunities. The other thing we need to think about is who's leading in which technologies. So does Australia go over there and have a look at the technology and learn, or does the country come back and do that, vice versa? Or do we both have skills in the area where we might be able to join up and accelerate and move on something really quickly to get up and work much closer together? And finally, there's the essential elements of a research partnership. Does it have a rationale? Do we fit? Can we talk? What's the deal structure going to look like? Who's going to pay for what and who's got the best labs? So all these things need to be worked out going forward. Just in a really quick summary, because I can see my time is getting up there. I think what I'd like to say is that hydrogen's got a huge opportunity, but there's a long way to go. I think when we think about research, we really are looking for the key uncertainties and the lack of data and knowledge in the industry where it can come and help. So where industry won't be doing it because they can't afford to do it, they can't or don't have the capabilities to do it, and there's uncertainties running rife through that particular question, then research can come in and help. So if you have any ideas on that, I'd love to hear them. And finally, for more information, I'd like to direct you to 2 websites we have up. One that's trying to record all the projects that are occurring in Australia and some overseas. This is called High Resource. These 2 websites are the ones I'm talking about getting lots of hits. So we know it's high value and worth having a look at. And the other one is trying to attempt to capture all the research occurring in Australia, and hopefully we'll be adding the international component to that as well, and that's called the High Research. So thanks very much, Molly, and I'll finish up there.
Dan, so much for your kind presentation, and I would like to highlight again, the research partnership is extremely important because that's why we can learn from multiple projects instead of letting these projects, stay independent of each other. So experience and project sharing is extremely important. And I have one question for Dan. From the technical perspective, because we know that for Australia to do hydrogen export, marine transportation is one of the key areas that we need to focus on. With regards to hydrogen carriers, there are multiple options that we have that are available right now, including ammonia, liquid hydrogen, LHC, MCH, etc. So what technology lines that you are looking into right now? And what do you think that would be having a lion's share in the near future?
Well, these are great questions, and I think they are all in the future. So it's hard to have a good answer, to be honest. All of these things have different, what we call technical readiness levels. So you'll see ammonia has been around for a very long time, and we know how to create it and use it and move it. So it's a bit easier. But I think but you also have to crack and move hydrogen in and out of it, which makes it inefficient. I think liquid hydrogen is the holy grail. You don't have to do as much to it, but it's very hard to move. So people are looking at both. We're seeing some countries want to move hard on ammonia right now because they want to set up, say, hubs and the demand side, where others want to invest in both, or some are just wanting to wait for liquid hydrogen. So it's a mixed bunch, and I don't think there's a real clear answer on it yet. Yeah, a lot more to go. I'd also say that if anyone wants to have a more detailed answer on that particular question, let me know, and I can put you in touch with the more technical-minded scientists who will be able to help you out.
Of course, and I also want to raise this question on behalf of port authorities or terminal portal representatives. So what are the port infrastructure requirements for large-scale import and export business for hydrogen?
Port infrastructure requirements. Yeah, again, that's out of my space. Maybe Gabrielle could answer that, because she talked a lot about that voyage from Melbourne up to Kobe. But if I could take that one on notice, Molly, and I could come back to you in the group. Okay,
sure. Yeah, I think there's one question directed to you in the Q&A box, which is mainly around oxide electrolyzers. I'm not a technical expert, so I will just repeat the question to you. So is CSIRO conducting any research on solid oxide electrolyzers, and is there any indications that electrification will increase?
Inefficiencies. Well, again, I think I'll take this to one of our researchers working in this area. So if we can get, is it Sakat's details, I'll come back to them. But we are working on the efficiencies with the hydrogen separation and those sort of matters to make it more efficient. So yes, we're working in the space. There's others in Australia doing it. But again, I think I'll come back and answer that one.
Yeah, understood. And because, technology is a very complicated question. So
across this complete supply chain.
Yeah, I saw there are two more potential partnerships for CSIRO who are requesting your contact, your method of contacts. So perhaps you can, I will leave you to for further discussion after this live stream.
Sure, that'd be great.
Thanks, Dan. And now, without further ado, let's welcome our next speaker on stage, Mr. Chow, Vice President of APAC Consulting with Mackenzie. Joe, are you here?
Yes, I am. Thanks, Molly. Let me just switch to my screen.
Sure. Sorry for interrupting your lunchtime, but the floor is yours.
No problem. All right. Molly, do you see my screen? I'm sharing my screen at the moment. Hopefully everybody can see the screen. All right. Thanks to the organizer for the opportunity for us to come and share with Mackenzie's views on the hydrogen development and trade. Molly, are you hearing me okay? I'm getting a fair bit of feedback.
I can hear you clearly.
On the mic.
No voice breaking.
Okay. Okay. All right. All right. Thanks for that. All right. Good afternoon, all. I represent Wood Mackenzie. So I'm part of the advisory and consulting team for Wood Mackenzie sitting in Singapore. So I head up the hydrogen consulting practice for Wood Mackenzie in Asia Pacific. Now, for those of us who are not too familiar with Wood Mac, we are essentially a global leader in consulting and advisory service for the energy industry, as well for other commodities. So like my previous speakers have mentioned, we are looking at the hydrogen industry. The hydrogen economy has a very exciting development for the energy industry. It has the potential to decarbonize a lot of the energy sectors that are traditionally very dependent on the fossil fuels, right? So it is one of the key platforms for potentially decarbonization of the industry. Now, today I've been asked to speak on what is Singapore doing in terms of pushing for trade of the hydrogen industry. Now, I thought it would be a bit more effective to really talk about some of the factors that are driving the hydrogen industry within Asia Pacific. Like my previous speakers have mentioned, a lot of things, a lot of factors, a lot of things. We see the hydrogen business developing to a point where people are investing, people are looking at the hydrogen as a source of energy to displace fossil fuel. So today I want to talk about some of these factors, some of the house views that we think the hydrogen market would develop over the next 20, 30 years, and how potentially trade and supply chains could be set up. All right. Now, first and foremost, it's useful to talk about where we think the hydrogen market would be in terms of the magnitude and the size of the market would be between now and 2050. Obviously, people are looking at hydrogen as a way to decarbonize, as an option to hit a net zero economy. Now, we would not say that we have a view on where the world would be headed. So it's always effective. It's always useful to look at different scenarios. So this is where Wood Mac comes in. We provide views on where the world would be headed, depending on the path that each of the major economies would be embarking on. So what we have developed here are very different scenarios, or fairly different scenarios. We have what we call a base case, which means the world gets on a track where the climate change is limited to about 2.5 to 2.7 degrees. Now we have what we call an AET2, an accelerated energy transition, where the world hits about a 2 degrees climate change. And obviously we have an AET 1.5, where the world is getting on a path where it's meeting a 1.5 degrees climate change. All right. So depending on what sort of scenario we envision, the market size and the consumption of low carbon hydrogen could potentially be different. So if you look at the chart on the right-hand side, a very conservative view with the world hitting about 2.5 to 2.7 degrees, the world would consume something like 210 million tons of hydrogen by 2050. Now, at the top end of the scale, if the world needs to get on a 1.5 degrees climate change, the size of the hydrogen market is above 500 million tons, all right? But nonetheless, if you look at even the conservative approach, between now, where the world is consuming practically not a whole lot, it's at a 0 point where low carbon is hardly consumed except for a number of test cases. It is growing from 0 to 210 million tons in a space of 25 to 30 years. Now, that by any means is a very strong pace of growth in terms of low carbon hydrogen consumption. Now, obviously at the top range from 0 to 530, that is a very strong pace of growth. But again, that is a number that is worked backwards from where we think the world would need in terms of hitting a 1.5 degrees climate change. Now, in terms of the different shades of colors of hydrogen, again, in Wood Mackenzie, we have done a forecast based on our outlook of projects, of announced projects, on consumption, on government announcements. So if you look at the chart on the left-hand side, this is where we think the different shades of hydrogen would be between now and 2050. Now, it's important to note that low carbon hydrogen, the blue and the green hydrogen, production and consumption is growing significantly. But at the same time, it's also important to note that a lot of the low carbon hydrogen is actually displacing the conventional gray and brown hydrogen. Now, gray and brown hydrogen today is almost 100% of the market. Like Dan mentioned, a lot of the hydrogen is consumed in chemicals production. It's used in different parts of the economy, such as oil refining, for example. People use hydrogen as a way to treat fuels to lower the sulfur and the contaminant contents in things like gasoline and diesel. Now, so today, where we are, the world is using 100% what we call conventional hydrogen. That's gray and brown, gray coming from natural gas and brown hydrogen coming from coal. So over the space of the next 25 to 30 years, we anticipate that a big chunk of the conventional hydrogen to be displaced by what we call green hydrogen, essentially generated from renewable energy, renewable power like solar, like wind, hydro, some of the things that my previous speakers have touched on. Now, there is a fair chunk of blue hydrogen, not to the same extent that green hydrogen is anticipated, right? And obviously there are the others like the biomass derived hydrogen. Now, if I could focus your attention to the chart on the right, these are the traditional sectors where there are significant consumption of hydrogen. It's still in the space of chemicals production, generating ammonia. A lot of the ammonia today gets into the manufacturing of fertilizers, explosives in different parts of the world. Chemicals like methanol, for example, are consumers of hydrogen as well as carriers of hydrogen. Now, a big chunk in the middle there is oil refining. We anticipate oil refining to still require a fair bit of hydrogen. Obviously, the consumption of fuels like gasoline and diesel would be shrinking over time. So you do see a bit of that effect that the gray bar in the middle is declining over time as the consumption of hydrogen reduces in the oil refining sector. But at the same time, it's important to note hydrogen is being consumed in other new sectors, ground transportation. People are talking about fuel cells, vehicles, the Koreans, the Japanese. These are markets that are developing not only the technology in the engines, but also the network to distribute fuel that are essentially hydrogen to develop the retail networks. Now, obviously, hydrogen is getting into some of the key sectors like power, heating, as well as shipping. For example, Singapore is embarking on an initiative to potentially look at ammonia as a marine bunkering fuel. So potentially, if that is successful, we see ammonia displacing things like marine diesel and heavy fuel oil that has been the sort of the workhorse for the marine industry, right? So there are very exciting trends or exciting options and initiatives being developed by different governments and different locations. Now, when we talk about trade, obviously the trade of any commodities will try to optimize itself such as the buyers will tap into the lowest cost possible of supply. So it's important to note that when we talk about the different shades of hydrogen, we do have different costs of production. The gray hydrogen, for example, is the cheapest grade of hydrogen today. Some of it, depending on natural gas costs, would vary from less than $1 per kg to almost $2 per kg. Now, if you look at the other end of the scale, green hydrogen, depending on which location you are looking at, or what sort of capacity, what sort of renewable energy is available, you could see a kg of hydrogen ranging from about $2 to $15. So there is a wide range. So these are today's estimated numbers. So obviously to get into a global trade pattern for hydrogen, people need to be able to identify who are the low-cost producers. With trade, we always look at who are the competitive low-cost producers, right? And these are potentially the locations where people invest into new projects to supply deficit markets. Now, in terms of green hydrogen production by region, we've also done a market forecast on where we think the world would develop over the next 10, 15 to 25 years. Now, between now and 2040, we anticipate almost a 60 million tons of new capacity to be developed in key places like Europe, key places like Australia being represented by the light blue bar at the bottom of the chart. So we do anticipate a fair bit of new capacity coming up in Australia. Now, Canada is potentially another area where we have a significant amount of resources, both hydrocarbon as well as potentially renewables. Now, it's important that we look at natural gas as well. Natural gas being able to support production of blue hydrogen with carbon capture. So some of the locations with an abundance of natural gas resources like the Middle East, you see a fair bit of blue hydrogen production being invested into, all right? So by the end of 2050, we anticipate the world to have almost 160 million tons of low carbon hydrogen capacity, all right? So keeping that in mind, we talk about trade, all right? Now, the other thing to look at when we look at trade patterns, it's also important to look at the cost of production in different locations. Now, different locations would have different costs of renewables, different manufacturing costs, different costs of doing business. So when we look at trade patterns for hydrogen, we need to look at the cost of production for green hydrogen, in this case, represented by some of the key economies. Right at the top, we have Australia. Now, this is on an average basis, what we call a levelized cost of hydrogen production. So meaning that this is the cost of hydrogen that involves investments as well as operating costs, both the OPEX and the CAPEX gets into the cost. Now, we've also put together some of the Northeast Asian market cost estimation. Now, this is again a forecast. We have built in our models, the assumptions for the reduction of both CAPEX and OPEX over time. Like Dan mentioned, there needs to be a fair bit of research work getting the cost both of electrolyzers as well as OPEX down to a range where hydrogen starts to compete effectively with fossil fuels. So we do anticipate that in each of the key locations, the cost of production to decline over time. Now, we do see Australia being a fairly effective and competitive low-cost producer, has the technology has scaled up and improves over time. Now, in a place like Japan, unfortunately, we would see that Japan not having a strong position on renewables, Southeast Asia would not have access to the strong irradiation that some of the markets like Australia would see. So the cost of renewables, solar and wind, would potentially be much higher than the rest of the world. So these are where the trade opportunities would happen. You have markets that are able to produce very cost-effective hydrogen, moving hydrogen into markets that are deficit, that doesn't have the ability to produce a cost-effective hydrogen supply. So before we look at trade, understanding the cost position is important. Now, this is a sort of a summary on where we think the trade flows would be moving across the key regional markets. Now, North America, it's a location where we anticipate a fair bit of both consumption growth as well as supply growth. Now, production or supply is represented by the blue bars, whereas demand or consumption is represented by the red bars. Now, if you look at some of the markets on the right-hand side of the page, Australia, right there. Now, we've been talking about Australian projects, right? Australian domestic consumption. But longer term, we do anticipate that Australia would be a sort of an export market for hydrogen. Now, by 2050, we anticipate Australia to be able to produce something like 28 million tons of hydrogen. It consumes 2 within the domestic market. Now, again, these are forecast numbers. It really depends on what each of the locations would be doing. But longer term, we do anticipate Australia to be able to export some of the hydrogen, be it in the form of liquid hydrogen, it may be in the form of things like ammonia or methyl cyclohexane, MCH, into other parts of the world, for example, Northeast Asia. All right. Now, if you look at China, China is probably going to be one of the biggest hydrogen market in the world. Manufacturing something like 55 million tons, it consumes about 70 million, so it's a net short market. The rest of Asia is a deficit market, right? Despite the capacity growth, the Asian market continues to be a deficit market. So Asia represents a very strong opportunity for export producers like those in Australia to be able to move hydrogen into deficit markets, right? So we anticipate a fair bit of trade, global trade movements. Now, obviously with Asia, because of the proximity to places like the Middle East, we anticipate some of the hydrogen, especially the hydrogen coming from natural gas base with carbon capture from places like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE, to be hitting this part of the world as well. So potentially that there's a fair bit of competition, all right? So the low-cost producers will be targeting deficit markets like Asia. Now, it's important to note when you look at the nodes of trade flows, taking Japan as an example of a Northeast Asian market that requires a fair bit of importation of hydrogen and hydrogen derivatives to support the domestic consumption. Now, if you look at a market like Japan, Japan potentially can be surprised, right? Already we are seeing hydrogen hydrogen and ammonia projects are being developed in Australia that targets export markets for like Korea, like Japan, right? These are growing markets with not a whole lot of domestic supply. Now, again, if you look at some of the other big producers, export-oriented producers, Saudi Arabia is one of them. Again, the Saudis are showing very ambitious plans in terms of developing, moving away from the oil economy into renewables. So potentially Saudi Arabia can be a big exporter. Now, I've already mentioned North America. Canada is looking at exporting either blue or green hydrogen. Now, the other place would be South America, where potentially there's a fair bit of new investments. Again, Chile is one of those locations that have announced a fair bit of investments of hydrogen, potentially for export. Now, one of those things that is important to note, like I mentioned, when you have a trade pattern developed, it's always important to understand the cost, right, of supply. Now, when you look at all the different examples of potential exporters moving hydrogen or even ammonia or methanol into a market like Japan, now within Wood Mackenzie, we have developed a model, a huge model to model different markets where we think different deficit markets can be supplied effectively from different production sources. So just to give an example, if you look at the projects that have been announced over the next few years, so this is done on a 2025 basis, right? So these are more recent announced projects generating hydrogen and ammonia. Now, looking at the cost of production of hydrogen and ammonia and methanol reaching Japan, right? When you sort of line them up from different production. Now, these are the different countries. We look at the cost of production, we look at the cost of delivery, and we even look at the cost of reconverting things like ammonia back into hydrogen. So if we line them up and we benchmark them at $1 per kg hydrogen delivered to Japan, you can start to see a pattern, a profile of producers and exporters from the very competitive producers like those in Canada, those in Saudi Arabia. Obviously, liquid hydrogen, ammonia would be the choice of exports from some of these locations. Now, some of the infrastructure, we have estimated cost and shipping costs. What's the cost of shipping? What's the cost of refrigeration of hydrogen into liquid hydrogen, and having to regasify hydrogen back into gaseous form at the target market, all right? So this is a fairly comprehensive cost analysis on the different sources of derivatives, such as ammonia, methanol coming from different locations. Now, we start to see a pattern developing. Some of the green hydrogen, some of the green ammonia coming from locations like Australia. Yes, over time, we do anticipate cost reduction, but at the same time, when compared to other locations like Saudi Arabia and Canada, perhaps there is a bit of a cost gap. So over time, I think when people develop projects, people need to be conscious that there are different costs involved in different locations. You need to understand what your competitors are doing, all right? So when you look at trade flows, obviously the buyers want to source from the most cost-effective areas, which is why a lot of the Koreans users, the Japanese users, I think they are going around to different parts of the world, in the Middle East, in North America, in South America, even into places like Australia, looking at what are the cost competitiveness of developing projects in different locations. All right. So understanding the cost competitiveness of hydrogen is fairly important in terms of understanding the trade. Now, I think that's all time I have today. Obviously, this is a a slide pack that the organizers would be free to share. I think if anybody wants to have I've spoken about this morning, feel free to contact me. I think the contact email is listed there as well. All right. So Molly, I think I will hand the time back to you. If there are other questions, I'll be happy to take them on as well. All right.
Thank you, Joe, for the very informative presentation and the kind address. One question for you: what do you think would be the most critical obstacle for APAC to develop its hydrogen supply chain at the moment? And what opportunities do you see at this moment?
Right. I think one of the key obstacles now, when you talk about low carbon hydrogen, is having the cost-effective renewables energy come behind it, right? You always have to have a very competitive source of renewables. Now, a lot of the Asian governments especially are probably a little lagging behind the European countries in terms of setting subsidies, setting policies that guarantees that renewable energy projects can be effectively developed, right? So to be able to tap into things like green hydrogen, you need a viable source of renewables. So I think within APAC, that is probably one of the key challenges. Now, obviously, not all Asian countries are like Australia, for example. It's probably leading some of the developments within the Asia Pacific region. Countries like Japan, countries like Korea have announced national agendas and policies to help support the development of the hydrogen business. So I think over the next 10, 15, 20 years, a lot of these things needs to be developed, especially for the Asian locations that are still lagging behind, so to speak.
Right. And what about opportunities? What are the most prominent opportunities that you see in the near term and in the mid-range and in the long range? Right.
Now, obviously, the industry is at a very nascent stage, but again, we are already seeing trends. The Japanese and the Korean governments have announced very ambitious targets to develop low carbon hydrogen for importation into the domestic market to displace coal-fired generation. All right. There is a fair bit of opportunities for project developers to try to capture offtake agreements by some of these big Asian economies. Now, Singapore, for example, is, I think one of my previous speakers mentioned, is looking at opportunities to displace marine fuels. Now, Singapore is probably the biggest marine bunkering hub in the world, equivalent to about 50 million tons of fuel oil. Now, if you look at the energy content, 50 million tons of fuel oil is equivalent to probably about 100 million tons of ammonia. So by any means, that is a huge consumption of ammonia. All right, considering the ammonia market today is about 200 million tons. If Singapore consumes 100 million tons of ammonia, that's almost 50% of the market. Now, the Singapore government is embarking on a journey to try to displace some of the fossil fuels, the traditional fuels, with hydrogen. So these are some of the opportunities that project developers, suppliers, infrastructure developers can come into different markets to work with governments to potentially develop projects that cater to some of these longer term options.
Thank you, Joe. Due to the time limits, I would need to invite out our next and last speakers today. And thank you so much again for joining us, Joe.
Thank you.
Yeah, and now let me introduce Mr. Sean Conaty, partner of energy transaction practice of Hunton and Kurth, on the topic building a vibrant APAC hydrogen market, Japan paving the way. I studied a bit about Sean's bio. He started off his career from Sydney and Australia, and then moved to the ASEAN countries from Singapore to Vietnam, Myanmar, etc. And now in Tokyo, I think you are the real world representation of the APAC chain.
Thank you. Thank you, Molly. That's very kind of you. And thank you for the introduction. Thanks for the introduction to speak today. Let me just get the screen sharing happening. Yeah, I believe there we go. Yeah, thank you. And indeed, as Molly said, I have been based really all around APAC and trying to sort of envision the supply chain and where I've been living my life. From here in Tokyo, where I am now, my focus is on outbound investment from Japan into Southeast Asia and the wider Asia Pacific. I focus on the energy and power sector. In the past few years, having done a hard pivot to renewable energy and clean technology. Some of you may not have heard of Hunton Andrews Kurth. We are a law firm headquartered in the US, history of around 120 years with 900 lawyers at around 21 locations worldwide. Since the very start, the firm has been very focused on the energy sector, and it remains a central plank of the firm's offering to this day. Last year, for example, in the IJ Global League tables, we were ranked #1 globally for power infrastructure finance transactions in terms of number of deals and the total value of the deals. So enough about us. Over the next 15 or 20 minutes, I know I'm a little bit against the clock. I'll update on recent developments in Japan's hydrogen policy and industry and show how this is contributing to the development of the hydrogen market in APAC. Japan has a strategy for creating a hydrogen society, is the term it used, which means using it in energy systems eventually with a view to displacing fossil fuels. Now, this is a remarkably ambitious vision in step with Japan's 2050 carbon neutrality goals. Now, it is ambitious, but I believe realizable. And there are three sort of foundations to Japan's approach. Firstly, having a sound policy framework with specific and measurable targets, oftentimes being a first mover in industrial hydrogen research and development. And also, very importantly, having a focus on forming strategic partnerships with other APAC nations, particularly for hydrogen supply. As we all know, in 2017, Japan became the first country in the world to release a national hydrogen strategy, the Basic Hydrogen Strategy. And this has been further embedded into national policy framework through issuance of the 5th and 6th strategic energy plans and a 2019 updated new strategic roadmap for hydrogen and fuel cells. These policies all really reiterate the ambitious goal of creating the hydrogen society, which is ambitious but achievable. What Japan aims to do is demonstrate a hydrogen supply chain, which we've heard of already today, demonstrating that this is feasible by the mid-2020s and commercializing it by 2030. Various targets and incentives have been set. Notable targets include 3 million tonnes of production and import by 2030, moving to 20 million tonnes by 2050. trying to reduce the price to $3 per kilogram by 2030 with future price target of $2 per kilogram. Corollary of this is the power generation price, 17 yen per kilowatt hour by 2030, and future targeting parity with LNG, which listed here as 12 yen per kilowatt hour, but we really need to query the impact of current LNG price spike and how prolonged and how pronounced that is going to be, and the long-term impacts of that. Japan has a goal of ammonia co-firing in existing coal-fired power plants, targeting 20% co-firing capability by 2030, which will probably be met well before that, and 50% by 2050. Japan's also a leader in fuel cell vehicles, and will aim to have 200,000 on the road by 2025, up from around 6,000 today, 800,000 by 2030, with a long-term view of really displacing gasoline cars on the roads. And similarly with respect to the fueling stations, Japan has the most in the world today at around 170, with a goal of having 320 by 2025 and 900 by 2030. Now, one way of going about achieving the targets is to ensure the industry is capable. And Japan has been right involved in the middle of many of the major industrial milestones as far as hydrogen supply is concerned across the supply chain. So we're talking production, transport, and storage and usage. So production, we saw in March 2020, the coming online of the Fukushima hydrogen energy research field with a 20 megawatt solar farm and 10 megawatt hydrogen production unit, being the largest class unit in the world. We've heard already today from Gabrielle and others about the Hystra Blue Hydrogen Supply Chain Project. And of course, Japan has also been spearheading the AHEAD Brunei methyl cyclohexane project, which saw the first end-to-end international transport of methyl cyclohexane from Brunei to Japan. Japan is also staying at the forefront of innovation and considering new approaches, for example, hydrogen production through high temperature gas-cooled nuclear reactors relying on thermal decomposition of water into hydrogen, oxygen, and oxygen rather than electrolysis. In transport and storage, we've again seen Japan spearheading different supply chain trials of different transport options, including liquid hydrogen, MCH, and ammonia. The Suiso Frontier, first specialized liquid hydrogen character, completing its maiden voyage earlier this year. And of course, docking at the Kobe LH2 specialized hydrogen receiving terminal, again, a world first. Moving on to usage, this is key to stimulate demand, which is really what drives the supply chain. Here again, Japan has been at the forefront of things. Japan has made great strides in diversifying away from the current use of hydrogen, mainly in industrial processes and for fertilizer, particularly towards energy production. Particularly at the early stage, we've seen a lot of movement in respect of ammonia co-firing, which is particularly useful because the co-firing can take place in coal thermal plants with some retrofitting, and coal is lingering on in Japan longer than may have been anticipated. prior to the Fukushima disaster in 2011. Japan is also developing hydrogen single fuel plants, construction on the first of which started last year. And as we've heard from Dan earlier, hydrogen may also play a very important role as an energy storage medium and load balancer for intermittent renewables. On the going back to the ammonia of coal firing, again, as observed earlier, JERA caused a stir in the market by issuing the first RFP for supply of green ammonia for the period of 2027 to 2040. So this is the period after it has shown viability of co-firing at a level of 20%, which trials are currently being undertaken at JERA's Hekinan thermal power plant. And there are also plans to export this ammonia co-firing technologies to Southeast Asia to help with decarbonisation of the coal sector there and establish a regional network of expertise in this technology. As mentioned on transport, Japan has been a leader in hydrogen fuel cells in vehicles for a while now, and this will continue with the targets for increased fuel cell vehicle penetration and hydrogen fueling station penetration. On shipping, in furtherance of the International Maritime Organization's greenhouse gas reduction goals, Japan, as a major player in the shipping and shipbuilding sector, has released a roadmap to zero emission from international shipping, targeting heavy reductions in carbon intensity in shipping, and proposing various designs, including zero carbon emission hydrogen fueled ships. And aviation is another area that has been signalled by NEDO as a key area of research. In industry, the steel industry is the biggest carbon dioxide emitter in Japan, in Japanese industry. So the amazingly versatile thing about hydrogen is its ability to deeply decarbonize, so sort of unlock decarbonizing efforts in parts of the economy that have traditionally been quite difficult to abate carbon in, such as steel making. So METI has been promoting approaches here that could lead to 50% reductions in carbon dioxide emissions in steelmaking process by 2030. There is a realization in Japan that in order to create the hydrogen society, it can't go it alone. Regional collaboration will be key. Japan has released the green growth strategy through achieving carbon neutrality in 2050. And as part of this, it has launched the Asia Energy Transition Initiative. Through this, Japan will work with regional governments to work on energy transition roadmaps and the role that Japan can play in helping implement these roadmaps and the role of hydrogen in that transition. This clearly plays to Japan's strengths. It's been a key investor in many of the emerging markets in the Southeast Asia region, particularly, which is a region where energy demand will continue to see high levels of growth, 60% growth from 2019 levels by 2040. And with fossil fuel still accounting for a lot of that growth unless action is taken. So Japan, as mentioned, knows that it can't go it alone as far as building the hydrogen economy, the hydrogen society is concerned. Following release of the hydrogen strategy in 2017, Japan held the first hydrogen energy ministerial meeting in Japan in 2018. And subsequent to that, there have been a number of joint cooperation efforts with many countries, including Australia, as we've heard, and where there are a large number of projects the early phase of development, or in fact, in later phases of development in some cases, as has already been mentioned by my fellow panelists. More recent announcements show the importance of partnerships throughout the region. So Japan there has been announcements of a blue ammonia production plant in Indonesia at feasibility study stage, being spearheaded by JOGMEC and Mitsubishi, as well as the ENEOS partnership with Petronas on blue-green hydrogen production plant in Malaysia. And we should remember that all this is taking place in Japan, which has created an ecosystem where there is an availability of powerful financial incentives. The green growth strategy, which I mentioned earlier, has part of that was establishing a 2 trillion yen green innovation fund for renewable energy technology, including hydrogen, and many of the early recipients of funding have been in the hydrogen sector. This green innovation fund supplements existing policy instruments such as the joint crediting mechanism and JCM promotion scheme, under which NEDO provides significant financial support to projects utilizing innovative technology for carbon reduction and abatement in exchange for transference of carbon reduction credits. So what is the road ahead, and what can we expect, and what are some of the potential barriers that need to be overcome? As has been observed, bringing down costs is critical. Costs will continue to come down as a matter of market anyway. We've seen, of course, amazing drops in price in renewable energy, which are set to continue. And there are signs that similar trends may be underway with respect to electrolyzers. Again, the recent spike in gas prices is a reminder of the unpredictability of the fossil fuel markets compared to the steady price drops in solar and wind that we've seen over the past decade. Now, for how long and how severe the current high fossil fuel prices remain may play into a very interesting dynamic, which is the point at which green hydrogen reaches a price parity with blue hydrogen, and how long it may take the market to react to that. We should not forget that blue and green are not the only colors in play here. Green hydrogen, for all its advantages, does, depending on the technology used, require large land areas for the renewable energy production. And it undoubtedly has a huge role to play, but may be supplemented by, for example, pink hydrogen, which is electrolysis powered by nuclear power, or the nuclear thermal decomposition method I mentioned a few slides back. This could also play an important role. There are indications that more countries in APAC and Southeast Asia are beginning to more seriously consider nuclear as an option for energy diversification. We need to see success for the fuel cell penetration, and we also need to see emergence of preferred technologies, particularly for types of electrolyzer and transport mediums. It may be that as was observed earlier, different transport mediums, be it MCH, ammonia, or liquid hydrogen, will naturally play into different supply chains, and they can exist in parallel. But we need to see really what happens in that context and how it plays out over the medium term. It has been observed that Japan's standardization and legislative regime in respect of hydrogen still needs to catch up a little bit. it still has no color scheme or carbon intensity grading scheme, no guarantee of origin certification. In terms of transport and usage, hydrogen basically needs to comply with existing general high pressure gas regulations without any specialized laws. But METI is definitely looking at this. It's established working groups on certification, standards, and legal frameworks. Japan is admittedly behind other jurisdictions such as Germany, several other European nations, and Australia, which has, of course, recently launched its trial of its guarantee of origin scheme. But Japan will be watching these closely and undoubtedly learning from them. Finally, just coming to the cost issue, of course, there is the cost of capital and the financial burden of doing these projects on balance sheet or through use of subsidies and incentives. Subsidies and incentives are going to continue to be important for some time yet. But as we move away from that in the medium term, Japanese sponsors and lenders have traditionally been among the most active in the project financing of energy and infrastructure projects in Asia Pacific. And the expertise and reliability and creditworthiness of Japan's sponsors and the financing capabilities of JBIC and NEXI that they bring with them has been a key factor behind the momentum and success of many of the projects that I have worked on in APAC in my career. So it may still be early days, but the earlier we can start employing project finance techniques to some of these projects, the better. Thank you for listening. I know I've gone, we've gone a little over time, but I appreciate it. I hope that was helpful, and feel free to keep in touch with me. Thank you, Molly. Back to you.
Thank you, Sean. Just pursuant to your one of your slides, you mentioned pink hydrogen. It's also one of the trendy topic in France right now. Are we seeing any regulation updates with regard to pink hydrogen development in Japan?
Well, I mean, I think in terms of regulatory updates, nothing specific to mention, but in terms of the roadmaps for development of hydrogen and its place within the broader energy transition, Japan, of course, is still recovering from the Fukushima disaster in 2011. But there is a recognition now that nuclear will play a role in Japan's energy mix going forward, with a view to basically, I think, restarting more reactors after 2030, or building more SMR reactors in the 2030, from the 2030 period onward. And I believe that with the EU taxonomy decision to include nuclear along with LNG as a sustainable transition energy source is very helpful in this regard as well. So I think we can expect to see some momentum for nuclear generally, but also potentially pink hydrogen with the potentially smaller footprint for creation of commercial scale quantities of hydrogen.
Understood. The reason I ask this question is because Japan is more like an importer, a net importer of hydrogen. In the case that Japan can leverage its nuclear power, potentially that will change Japan's, buyer's profile. So they can use their domestically produced hydrogen. So just one side question. It's not very related to our topic today, but thank you so much for the kind address. And I'd also love to ask one question. So besides the current major energy players investing in the hydrogen business, Who else do you think should consider putting hydrogen into their asset portfolio? Do you think the market is ready to embrace more players?
Yeah, it might be a little bit early. It's interesting to see. It's interesting to see the oil majors getting involved in some of these demonstration projects. I know as they try to decarbonize and move towards their own carbon neutral by 2050 goals, they have been getting involved in the renewable sector. But it is already a very crowded place, and margins are getting more challenging in that sector. So I think hydrogen is a more natural fit for those players, and particularly bringing with them expertise from the LNG sector as well. So I think we can see that trend to continue. In terms of other investors, I mean, I think it's possible, and I think particularly if you look at forming partnerships with more established players, say in Japan, who can access some of the funding available through mechanisms like the JCM and the Green Innovation Fund, then we could definitely see more people, more new players come to market, and it's a sector that's ripe for innovation and new technologies. So, you know, the biggest players may still be yet to emerge in terms of some parts of the supply chain.
Understood. And as you also mentioned, the financing part of the business, how would you describe the risk appetite of lenders towards hydrogen business in Japan right now?
I mean, I think there's clearly it's a good question. Thank you. It's struggling to try to answer. It's one where I think people are extremely keen to get involved and get exposure. But there is a realization that, you know, it is too risky to do things in a kind of limited recourse fashion at this point. The regulatory environment is not there. The offtake is not there. Now, that's not to say that things couldn't be structured to allow that. But I think, you know, as I think was observed earlier by one of our speakers, offtake is key. So for some of these projects, we do have offtake arrangements in place, but the bankability of those arrangements and against a background of a legislative, you know, regime that's not really set in place yet is still very challenging. But definitely the desire is there, and structures could be put in place to do it. And if you properly allocate things for things like risks of change in law, etc., then it's something that could be feasible. But it's still very challenging at this stage.
Thank you, Sean, for the kind address. So that's why we need experts like you and many lawyers to help us guide the business. I think time flies, and there's only one question that we can accommodate for Gabrielle. So Gabrielle, I received one message from our listeners asking for the policy supports and incentives that are available for setting up component manufacturing in Victoria. Can you elaborate a bit more on that part?
And thanks for the question. Just generally, my area of remit is specifically in the energy sector, so I won't talk more broadly over sort of some of the incentives in the manufacturing sector. what I can say is the Victorian government does have a range of policies and incentives to support the establishment of supply chain in the energy sector. We're doing a range of activities in that space, and I would urge anyone who is interested in becoming part of our energy economy to reach out to us, and depending on the nature of manufacturing or which part of the supply chain you'd like to become a part of, we can help you understand the local landscape, what types of support and policies and incentives might be applicable for your particular business. So obviously on my slide, I provided some contact details to my business and industry engagement team. That's a great place to start. We also have Victorian government, we've got 23 trade and investment offices around the world. So feel free to reach out to your local trade and investment office. They can always help with any inbound market visits and helping connections directly with local participants, financiers, regulators, retailers, market operators, and key stakeholders and so on. We've also got a dedicated area of Invest Victoria, and they can provide assistance on regulatory information, statutory approvals, coordination, site location services, identification of infrastructure, utility requirements, and advocacy within government. So we've got lots of ways to help. And there are some specific incentives available, but I just do urge anyone that's interested to get in touch directly.
Thank you, Gabrielle. And I'd like to reinforce that all the slides will be shared along with our recording today with all of you through email later this week. And if you have other questions, please feel free to drop me an email or leave your contact so we can relay your message. And now I believe the event is coming to an end here. I believe that through this webinar, we have gained new insights and understanding of the APAC hydrogen supply chain market. Once again, I would like to thank all the guests and audience for your active participation and consistent support in making this event a success. I'd like to thank again for Gabrielle, Nick, Dan, Sean, and Joe for your contribution. We look forward to our next encounter, and thank you so much to all listeners. This is the end of our webinar.
Thanks, Molly.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Gabrielle.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.